Well, the Law Foundation funding was really important in terms of supporting this research, so it actually allowed me to travel to my comparator states and to talk to people actually involved in implementing oceans management, so Canada Ocean Fish, which is the main organisation within Canada, and the Marine Management Organisation in the UK. So that was actually really kind of a valuable part of the research. Also allowed me to employ research assistants at the early stages to provide documentation and to support the early stages of that research. So it's really valuable in terms of its support. New Zealand's maritime area, which if you include the extended continental shelf, is actually 21 times as much as its terrestrial area, so it's huge. Nearly 80% of New Zealand's biodiversity is actually located in the marine environment. Half the world's species of whales can be found in New Zealand's waters. A quarter of the world's species of seabirds are located within New Zealand's territory. We as New Zealanders, of course, are dependent upon the oceans for food, travel, recreation, energy and so forth. And of course the oceans are also of cultural importance, particularly to Maori. So I think it's really vital that we take care of our oceans, and an important part of that conservation framework is law and policy. It essentially provides the underpinning for much of that conservation framework. So really funding from the Law Foundation just allows researchers to investigate our law, critique our law to improve it, compare it to others, to best practice, so that we can really try to improve our ocean governance for current and perhaps most importantly for future generations. Well, I think in terms of my research I identified a number of sort of key areas of legislative reform. One of the prominent ones, slightly shorter term, is in relation to the issue of marine protected areas. And actually during my research the government released a consultation paper proposing a new act for marine protected areas. So currently in New Zealand, marine protected areas are established under the Marine Reserves Act and under specialist legislation, but what we don't have is a coherent network of areas, and we're really not in a position to meet our international obligations, which actually requires us to protect 10% of our entire maritime zone by 2020. So one of the issues that I'm really interested in is looking at marine protected areas legislation, sort of critiquing the proposals which have been made and actually contributing to reform in that area. So I'd see that as one of the key issues. More generally, I'm quite interested in an integrated approach to oceans governance and marine management, and that's being increasingly adopted in other regions, but hasn't really been pursued here. So part of my research is actually looking at some of the models which you find in other regions and looking at to see the extent to which we could try to develop a more integrated approach to oceans governance. The issue of New Zealand leadership in oceans governance is actually quite an interesting one. So at the international level, New Zealand often plays, a really important leadership role. So a current example at the moment is the role it's playing in connection with the negotiations for an instrument to protect biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. So it's playing a really important role there. At the domestic level, by contrast, I think it's increasingly difficult to argue that New Zealand is actually an international leader. So it's not adopting some of the more modern and integrated and ecosystem focused approaches to oceans governance in comparison to other states. However, in my research I have found that even where those approaches are more advanced in other states, it's actually quite difficult to implement them on the ground. So looking at Australia, Canada and the UK, which were my comparator states, they certainly look much better than New Zealand on paper, but there are clear challenges in implementing some of the provisions and the policies within that legislation. So actually I'd say New Zealand perhaps isn't as far apart as from some of those states as it would perhaps look on paper. I think in terms of the shorter and longer term impacts of the research, certainly from a shorter term, I would hope it would have some impact in connection with the debate on marine protected areas. So having produced that consultation document, the government appears to have sort of shelved that project, at least for the time being, probably until at least after the next election. So there's certainly time to influence that particular legislation. So in terms of the consultation, The proposed Act is still quite problematic in the sense that it only applies to the territorial sea and not to the exclusive economic zone, and there are some other significant limitations. So there's definitely scope to influence that kind of ongoing process in respect of that consultation. More generally, I would hope that my research would sort of influence managers, government officials and others to kind of think about the more integrated approach to oceans management, this idea of being more proactive in terms of deciding what activities we actually want to support, identifying kind of those key values and as to whether those activities support those values or not. So that's sort of be the longer term impact that I'll be hoping for.